The lecture hall is full, every seat taken, backpacks under chairs. The low hum of conversation bouncing off concrete walls and high ceilings. It's the kind of room where reputations are made quietly and lost even quieter. At the front stands the professor, gray blazer, rolled up sleeves. The confidence of someone who has never been challenged in this room. He doesn't raise his voice to get attention. He doesn't need to. When he turns toward the board, the room settles on instinct. "All right," he says, picking up the marker. "Let's try something different today." A few students straighten in their seats. "This," he continues, writing deliberately, "is not undergraduate material." The marker squeaks as symbols begin to appear. Long integrals, nested expressions, variables layered inside variables. The kind of math that makes even strong students uneasy. "This is graduate-level math," the professor says, glancing back at the room. A faint smile tugs at the corner of his mouth. The sort of problem that separates those who are prepared from those who aren't. A ripple of quiet laughter moves through the rows. "Let's see," he adds casually, "who really belongs here." The camera shifts not to the board, but to a student halfway up the room. He's quiet, hoodie pulled slightly forward, a notebook open in front of him, pages already filled with neat, tight handwriting. He isn't laughing. He isn't reacting at all. His pen moves steadily, copying the equation as it grows longer and more complex. He doesn't look up. Around him, heads tilt in his direction. Someone whispers something and stifles a laugh. Another student smirks, already certain of how this will end. The professor finishes the last line of the equation and caps the marker with a click. Silence. He turns, scanning the room like a judge waiting for a confession. "This problem," he says, "has never been solved in real time in this class." A pause. It's not meant to be solved today. It's meant to teach humility. A few students nod. Others lean back, relieved it won't be them. Then a hand rises, slowly, deliberately. The whispers stop. The professor's eyes land on the raised hand, and for just a fraction of a second, something like surprise flashes across his face, followed quickly by amusement. "You?" he asks. The student nods once, calm, respectful. The professor chuckles. Not loudly, just enough. "Well," he says, gesturing toward the board, "this should be educational." A few snickers ripple through the hall. The student stands, walks to the front, and takes the marker without a word. He faces the board. The equation towers over him, dense, intimidating, unforgiving. The room leans in. No one expects this to take long. The narrator's voice cuts through the silence, low and measured. The professor thought this equation would end the conversation. He didn't realize it was about to end his. The marker touches the board, and the first line begins to change. The student hadn't always been in that lecture hall. He transferred mid-semester quietly, without announcements or introductions. No honors list mention, no whispered reputation. Just a name added to the roster and a seat filled near the middle rows. He didn't arrive with a story that demanded attention, and he didn't try to create one. He showed up early, took notes, asked questions only when necessary. When discussions grew loud, he listened. When others argued for the sake of being heard, he waited. In a room where confidence often spoke louder than understanding, he chose silence. It made him easy to overlook, especially in a class like this. The professor's course was infamous, not because it was unfair, but because it was unforgiving. This was a class students warned each other about, the kind that shaped transcripts and futures, the kind taught by a professor whose name appeared on journal covers and conference banners. He was renowned, published, quoted. His reputation for rigor was legendary. He believed in pressure, believed that discomfort revealed truth, that only those who truly belonged would survive the strain. Many admired him for it. Others feared him. No one questioned him, at least not publicly. He paced when he lectured, spoke with precision, corrected mistakes instantly. And when he called on students, it was rarely random. He cold called the confident ones, the outspoken ones, the students whose hands were already halfway up before the question was finished. He challenged them aggressively, pushed back hard, sharpened them in front of everyone. But there were others he never called on. The quiet student noticed this early. When discussions opened, eyes passed over him. When questions hung in the air, they landed elsewhere. On days when participation grades were quietly tallied, his name was rarely spoken. Once, just once, the professor paused near his row, glanced at his notebook, and moved on. Another time, when the student asked a question after class, the professor responded politely but briefly. A quick answer, no follow-up, no curiosity. And then there were the comments, not direct, never explicit. "This material assumes a strong foundation," the professor would say, eyes sweeping the room. "Some of you may need to reconsider whether this is the right level." Or, "Not everyone here has had the same preparation." They landed softly, vaguely, but not accidentally. The student heard them. Others did too. Yet he stayed. He didn't complain, didn't correct assumptions, didn't volunteer explanations about where he came from or what he knew. He trusted the work to speak when the time came, if it ever did. The narrator's voice settles in, steady and reflective. Some people test knowledge. Others test belonging. By the time the professor turned back to the board that day, marker in hand, the roles in the room already felt assigned. The professor believed he knew who belonged. The class believed it too. And the students still taking notes, still quiet, waited for a moment no one else saw coming. The professor steps back toward the board, the marker still uncapped in his hand. "Before we move on," he says, tapping the white surface once for emphasis, "I want to leave you with something." He gestures to the equation now filling nearly half the board. It's dense, layered, brutal in its elegance. Symbols nested inside symbols, integrals wrapped around expressions that seem to resist intuition. The kind of equation that doesn't invite curiosity. It dares you to fail. "This," he says calmly, "is not the sort of thing you solve in real time." A pause. It's considered unsolvable in a classroom setting. A few students shift in their seats. Someone exhales through their nose. Others stare at the board with the quiet relief of knowing they won't be expected to touch it. "It's not here for you to get the answer," the professor continues. "It's here as a teaching moment." He underlines a section of the equation with the marker. "To remind you that mathematics has limits. And so do we." The words hang in the air, polished and practiced. "Some of you," he adds, eyes sweeping the room, "may still be adjusting to the level of rigor this course demands." A subtle smile flickers across his face, controlled, almost kind. The class chuckles, not loudly, just enough. Then a hand goes up. At first, the professor doesn't notice. He's still looking at the equation, explaining why certain approaches would fail. But the movement draws attention. A few students glance sideways. A whisper breaks out. The hand stays raised. The professor turns. His eyes land on the student standing quietly in the aisle row, arm extended, not stiff, not defiant, just there. For a moment, the room is completely still. Then the professor smiles. Not a warm smile, not an encouraging one, a measured smile. The kind that signals indulgence. "Yes," he says. The student clears his throat. "I think I can try," he says evenly. A ripple of laughter spreads through the room, this time less restrained. Someone mutters, "No way." Another voice whispers, "Is he serious?" The professor lets the laughter run a second too long before raising his hand. "All right," he says, chuckling softly. "All right." He tilts his head, studying the student as if reassessing something he already decided. "Well," he says, "confidence is important." More laughter. "This problem," he continues, "has challenged doctoral candidates. People who've been doing this for years. He steps aside slightly, opening a clear view of the board. But, he adds, with a light shrug, there's value in experience. The word lands with weight. Go ahead, he says. It'll be educational. A few students exchange looks. Someone shakes their head. A girl in the front row bites her lip, unsure whether to smile or look away. The student walks to the front. Each step feels louder than the last. The marker is placed in his hand. The professor releases it willingly, almost theatrically, like a baton being passed in a relay no one expects him to finish. Take your time, the professor says, stepping back. There's no rush. He folds his arms. The silence stretches. The room, moments ago alive with whispers, settles into an uncomfortable quiet. Every eye is on the board now or on the student standing beneath it. The equation looms. The student doesn't speak, doesn't react to the audience. He studies the board, head slightly tilted, eyes moving methodically from one term to the next. Seconds pass. 10, 20. Someone coughs. The professor checks his watch. Subtle, intentional. A student in the back suppresses a laugh. The marker touches the board, but only briefly. The student writes a single symbol, then stops. Stares. Erases it. Writes again. Cleaner this time. The professor shifts his weight, a faint smirk returning. This is where it usually becomes clear, he says lightly, not quite addressing anyone in particular. The student keeps working. Line by line, he rewrites part of the equation, not solving it, not simplifying it, but reorganizing it, changing its shape. A few students lean forward despite themselves. The professor uncrosses his arms. He steps closer. What are you doing? He asks, curiosity creeping into his voice before he can stop it. Reframing, the student replies quietly. The word draws a few raised eyebrows. The professor laughs once. Short, sharp. Interesting choice, he says. But that approach won't. He stops. Because the board doesn't look the same anymore. The equation is still there, but something has shifted. What once looked tangled now looks intentional. Patterns begin to emerge. Symmetry where there was none before. The room feels different. No one laughs now. The professor straightens. He takes another step forward, eyes narrowing, not with mockery, but with focus. The student continues, unhurried. The narrator's voice enters, steady and unflinching. This wasn't a lesson. It was a performance. The marker pauses. The student steps back half a pace, studying what he's written. The professor stares at the board. And for the first time since the class began, he doesn't say a word. The room holds its breath. The student stands inches from the board, marker resting loosely between his fingers. He doesn't write immediately. He doesn't fill the silence with explanations or apologies. He simply looks, eyes moving slowly from left to right, top to bottom, taking in the equation as if it were a landscape rather than a challenge. Behind him, the lecture hall begins to stir. A chair creaks. Someone shifts their backpack with a sharp zip. A low whisper snakes through the rows and is quickly hushed. The professor remains near the podium, arms folded, his posture relaxed in a way that suggests patience, but not faith. The student still doesn't rush. He tilts his head, just slightly, and exhales. Then the marker touches the board. One line. Just a single, careful transformation. Not a solution. Not even close. More like a translation, changing the language of the equation without altering its meaning. It pauses. The professor glances down at his watch. Not dramatically. Just enough for the front row to notice. A silent message. We don't have all day. The student studies the line he's written. His brow furrows not in panic, but in evaluation. Then he reaches up and erases it. A few students smirk. Already? Someone whispers. He rewrites the line cleaner this time. More deliberate. The chalk squeaks softly against the board. the only sound cutting through the room. In the seats, impatience grows. Someone taps a pen repeatedly against their notebook. Another student sighs, loud enough to be heard. A few heads turn toward the professor, waiting for him to step in and end this. But the professor doesn't interrupt. Not yet. The student continues to work, but slowly, almost stubbornly so. He rewrites a section of the equation not to simplify it, but to expose a hidden structure. A substitution here, a rearrangement there. Each move seems small on its own, insignificant even, but together, they begin to change the shape of the problem. The noise in the room rises and falls in waves, whispers, starting, stopping, starting again. The contrast sharpens, the class restless and loud, the students still and focused. Ego versus calm. The professor clears his throat. Remember, he says lightly, this isn't about getting the answer. A few students nod, relieved. The student doesn't respond. He races again, rewrites again. Each version cleaner than the last. His handwriting tightens, confident and precise. The board now shows a transformed version of the original equation, still complex, still daunting, but undeniably more ordered. The professor takes a step closer. You're circling, he says, voice measured. But you're not progressing. The student pauses, marker hovering in the air. For a moment, it looks like he might turn around, explain himself, defend his approach. He doesn't. Instead, he adds a small notation in the margin, something easy to miss, a constraint, a condition. The professor frowns. What's that? He asks. A boundary. The student replies quietly. The professor scoffs just slightly. That won't help you here. The student nods once, as if acknowledging the comment, and continues anyway. The room grows quieter. Even the whispers die down now. Something about the way the equation is changing, slowly, methodically, has pulled the class in despite themselves. The chaos that once defined the board is giving way to structure. Patterns begin to emerge where there were none before. The professor's confidence shifts. It's subtle, but it's there. He stops checking his watch. His arms fall to his sides. He steps closer again. The student finishes another line, then steps back, evaluating. He rubs his spot on the board where he erased too aggressively, smoothing it out, then rewrites the expression neatly. Time stretches. No payoff yet. No reveal. Just a quiet grind of thought. The narrator's voice slips in, low and deliberate. The room was loud with doubt. The board was quiet with intention. The student sets the marker down for the first time and looks at the equation as a whole. Then, finally, he turns. He doesn't address the class. He looks directly at the professor. "Can I ask one thing?" he says. The question lands heavier than any equation. The professor blinks, caught off guard. "What?" he asks. The student gestures toward a specific term near the center of the board. "Are we assuming continuity here?" he asks. "Or is the function allowed to break under transformation?" The room freezes. The professor opens his mouth, then stops. Because the question isn't basic. It isn't naive. It's precise, technical. The kind of question you only ask when you're already deep inside the problem. A few students glance at each other. The professor looks back at the board, then at the student. For the first time, there's no smile on his face. And the silence that follows is different from before. He answers slowly. "It's assumed continuous," he says. The student nods. "Thank you," he says softly, and turns back to the board. The marker lifts again. And now, the room knows something is coming. The marker moves again. But this time, the student doesn't add to the equation. He steps back and draws a thin line through the middle of the board, not crossing anything out, not erasing, just dividing space. Then he begins rewriting the problem on the right side, piece by piece, in a way no one expects. He isn't simplifying. He's restructuring. Instead of attacking the equation head-on, He pulls it apart, isolating relationships, lifting hidden dependencies out of the clutter. A substitution appears where there shouldn't be one. A symmetry is exposed that wasn't obvious before. He flips the perspective entirely, treating the equation not as a single obstacle, but as two conversations happening at once. The room shifts. At first, no one understands what they're seeing. A few students frown, trying to follow. Others lean forward, notebooks forgotten. The board no longer looks like a wall. It looks like a map. The professor watches in silence. The smile that once sat comfortably on his face has faded. Not abruptly, not dramatically. It just disappears. His posture straightens. His head tilts. He squints, not with mockery now, but with concentration. He steps closer. The student keeps working. He introduces an unexpected approach, one that isn't typically taught at this level. Not flashy, not showy, elegant in its restraint. He reframes the equation as a transformation problem rather than a direct solve, translating complexity into structure. The professor's brow furrows. He opens his mouth, then closes it. The student writes another line, then pauses. He erases a small section, only a symbol or two, and rewrites it cleaner, tighter, as if polishing a sentence rather than correcting a mistake. The class is silent now. No whispers, no laughter, no shifting backpacks. Even the air feels still. The narrator's voice enters slowly, deliberately, as if not to disturb the moment. That's when the room felt it. Something was happening. The professor takes another step forward. He's close enough now to see the fine details, the careful notation, the intentional spacing, the absence of guesswork. This isn't trial and error. This is direction. He leans in. That doesn't. He begins, then stops. He studies the line the student just wrote. His eyes move back to the original equation on the left side of the board. Then back again. Something clicks. The student continues, unaware or unconcerned about the shift behind him. He draws a small bracket around a section of the rewritten equation, then adds a brief note beneath it. Not an explanation, just a condition. The professor inhales sharply. A student in the front row notices and glances sideways at a friend. Another student's pen freezes mid-word. The professor's confidence doesn't collapse, but it cracks. He straightens, hands falling to his sides. His gaze flicks to the clock at the back of the room, then back to the board. Time, which once felt abundant, now feels insufficient. The student reaches the end of the line he's working on and stops. He steps back half a pace. He doesn't turn around. He doesn't announce anything. He just looks at the board quietly, carefully, as if asking it a question. The professor waits. Seconds stretch. The student lifts the marker again and adds one final transformation. It's subtle, easy to miss, but it changes everything. The board now tells a different story. What once looked impossible now looks resolved. Not solved in the traditional sense. No box around a final answer. No dramatic underline, but complete. Closed. Internally consistent. The student sets the marker down. He folds his hands loosely in front of him. Still, he says nothing. The silence becomes unbearable. The professor steps right up to the board now, so close his shoulder nearly brushes the student's. He scans the work from top to bottom, slowly, methodically. His lips move, silently retracing steps, once, twice. His eyes widen just slightly. He steps back, then forward again, checking a different path. He reaches out, stops himself, then finally takes the marker and retraces one line himself. It holds. He swallows. The class feels it before he says anything. That subtle shift when authority hesitates. When certainty gives way to verification. When a man used to being right begins to check. The professor lowers the marker. He looks at the student not with amusement now, not with indulgence, but with something closer to disbelief. You didn't finish, he says slowly. The student meets his eyes for the first time. I did, he replies calmly. I just didn't announce it. A murmur ripples through the room. The professor turns back to the board, scanning again. His shoulders tense. His jaw tightens. He realizes it. The equation isn't missing anything. It's complete. And the moment lands not with applause, not with triumph, but with a heavy, undeniable stillness. The professor steps back. The student remains where he is. And in that silence, everyone understands. The problem wasn't impossible. The assumption was. The student breaks the silence first, quietly, almost respectfully. If continuity holds, he says, eyes still on the board, then the system collapses into a constrained transformation. The solution exists in the boundary, not the expansion. The words are calm, measured, not performative. The professor reacts on instinct. That's not, he starts, stepping forward, hand lifting as if to cut the sentence in half. Then he stops, mid-word. His eyes lock onto the board. Something about what the student said doesn't sound wrong. It sounds specific. Too specific to dismiss. The professor turns fully toward the equation now. He scans the right side first, then the left. His gaze moves faster than before, retracing steps, checking assumptions. The student continues, still not raising his voice. When you enforce continuity, he adds, the higher order terms cancel. What looks divergent isn't. It's bounded. The professor reaches for the marker. Not to correct, to verify. He writes directly beneath one of the student's lines, redirecting it himself. His movements are sharp, efficient, the reflexes of someone who has done this for decades. The line holds. He moves to the next step, rewrites it his way. It holds again. The room is completely silent now. No shifting, no whispering, no phones. Every eye is fixed on the board or on the professor's hand as it moves. The student steps back, giving him space. The professor works faster now, but not sloppily. He's not racing the clock, he's racing disbelief. Each step he retraces tightens the logic rather than breaking it. He reaches the final transformation. Stops. Stares. The solution is there. Not boxed. Not underlined, but undeniable. A student in the second row sees it first. Her eyes widen. She leans toward her friend, whispering without realizing how loud she is. Oh my God. It works. Another student follows the steps on his own notes, tracing the logic. His pen freezes midair. A third student exhales sharply. The realization spreads, not like applause, but like gravity. Quiet, heavy, inescapable. The professor lowers the marker. His shoulders drop. When he speaks again, his voice is different, softer, slower. You're saying, he begins carefully, that the divergence everyone assumes never actually manifests. The student nods once. Because the assumption forces it, he replies. If you remove that, the equation resolves. The professor turns back to the board, one last time, as if hoping to find a mistake he missed. There isn't one. He clears his throat. He stops, tries again. I need to correct myself. The words land like a shockwave. The class has never heard him say that. This problem, he continues, choosing each word deliberately, isn't unsolvable in real time. He gestures toward the board. It's unsolvable under the wrong assumption. He turns to face the student fully now. And you saw that. The student doesn't smile, doesn't nod triumphantly. He simply stands there, hands relaxed at his sides, breathing steady. The professor studies him not as a challenge now, not as an experiment, but as a peer he hadn't recognized. The narrator's voice enters, calm and resolute. The equation wasn't impossible. The assumption was. The professor looks out at the class. Let this be clear, he says. What you just witnessed wasn't speed. He gestures back to the board. It was perspective. He pauses, then adds quietly, almost to himself. And I missed it. The silence that follows isn't awkward. It's reverent. The student picks up his notebook from the front desk, returns the marker to its tray, walks back toward his seat without a word. As he passes the rows, heads turn, not with mockery now, but with something closer to awe. The professor watches him go. Then, after a long moment, he speaks again. "Class dismissed," he says softly. No one moves right away, because in those 60 seconds, something fundamental has changed. Not just an equation, but who everyone thought belonged at the board. The room doesn't erupt. There's no applause, no cheers, no dramatic gasp that breaks the moment open. Instead, something heavier settles in. The professor remains at the front of the lecture hall, standing just off to the side of the board. The equation, no longer intimidating, no longer untouchable, sits there quietly, complete in a way that feels final. He exhales, slowly. "This," he says at last, turning back toward the class, "requires acknowledgement." The word feels carefully chosen. Not celebration, not praise. Acknowledgement. He straightens his blazer, a subtle gesture of regaining composure. "I framed this problem," he continues, "as a boundary, as something meant to demonstrate limitation." He pauses, jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. That framing was incorrect. A ripple moves through the room, not sound, but reaction. A few students blink, as if unsure they heard correctly. Others glance at each other, eyebrows raised. The professor looks at the student again. "Your approach was valid," he says. "And more than that, it was insightful." The compliment lands awkwardly, like a sentence he isn't used to saying out loud. He hesitates. "I should have seen it," he adds. "I didn't." It isn't a full apology. Not yet. But it isn't deflection either. The student nods once. Not in agreement. Not in acceptance. Just acknowledgement. He doesn't smile. He doesn't speak. He gathers his notebook, adjusts the strap of his bag, and returns to his seat the same way he left it, quietly, without drawing attention to himself. That, more than anything else, unsettles the room. Because celebration would have made sense. This restraint does not. As he walks down the aisle, heads turn. The smirks from earlier are gone, replaced by something harder to name. Respect, awe, embarrassment. One student lowers his eyes, suddenly aware of the laugh he shared earlier. Another stares at the floor, cheeks warm. A girl in the front row watches him pass with an expression that borders on disbelief. He sits, opens his notebook, turns to the next page. The professor watches him for a moment, longer than necessary. Then he clears his throat. "There's a tendency," he says, addressing the class now, "to confuse silence with absence." No one interrupts. "No questions raised," he continues, "doesn't mean no understanding exists." His gaze flicks briefly, almost involuntarily, toward the student's row. "I allowed my assumptions to do the talking. The admission is reluctant, but it's real. I won't make that mistake again." The class absorbs this in stillness, not because they're afraid, but because they're processing something rare. Authority correcting itself. The professor turns back to the board. Erases a small section of the equation, not the solution, but the earlier note he wrote labeling it unsolvable. The eraser squeaks faintly. "There will be an addendum to today's lecture notes," he says, reflecting what we learned. What we learned. The phrasing matters. A few students exchange glances. One slowly nods, as if committing the moment to memory. The professor caps the marker and sets it down with care. "That's all for today," he says. "We'll continue next session." He doesn't add another word. The room stays quiet as students begin packing up. No one rushes. Conversations, when they start, are hushed, different in tone than before. As backpacks zip and chairs scrape lightly against the floor, eyes keep drifting back to one place. The student remains seated. He finishes a sentence in his notes, underlines it once, then closes the notebook, When he finally stands, it's unremarkable. No crowd parts for him. No one stops him. But something has shifted in the way people look at him. Not curiosity, recognition. The narrator's voice enters softly, not to punctuate the moment, but to frame it. Genius doesn't announce itself. It waits. The student exits the lecture hall without looking back. Behind him, the professor lingers. Alone now, the board half erased, the room emptying around him. He stares at the space where the equation once felt impossible. Then, quietly, so quietly no one else hears, he nods to himself, not in defeat, but in understanding. Long after the lecture hall empties, the moment lingers. Not because of the equation, but because of what surrounded it. On the surface, this was a story about math, about an assumption corrected, about a professor confronted with an oversight. But beneath that, something quieter and far more common was exposed. Bias rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive shouting insults or slamming doors. More often, it wears the language of standards, of rigor, of readiness. It hides behind phrases that sound neutral, even responsible. This course assumes a strong foundation. Not everyone is prepared for this level. Some people just aren't ready yet. On their own, these statements aren't wrong. Standards matter. Challenge matters. Excellence requires boundaries. But when standards are applied unevenly, when they're used to test belonging instead of understanding, they stop being measures of quality and start becoming filters of comfort. The difference between challenge and humiliation is intent. A challenge is designed to pull someone forward. It stretches, but it also supports. It assumes potential and invites growth. Humiliation does the opposite. It exposes. It isolates. It performs superiority rather than cultivating learning. It doesn't ask, "Can you do this?" It asks, "Do you deserve to be here?" In that lecture hall, the equation wasn't the real test. The test was who the room expected to fail, and how quickly it was willing to laugh when that expectation seemed confirmed. The uncomfortable truth is this: many voices never reach the board at all. They stay seated, quiet, heads down, not because they lack insight, but because experience has taught them that speaking carries risk. That being wrong will be remembered longer than being silent. That asking a question can mark you as unprepared rather than curious. So they wait. They learn to listen more than speak, to refine ideas internally, to do the work without demanding recognition. And too often, the world mistakes that quiet for absence. The narrator's words return, steady and reflective. Talent doesn't always look familiar. We like to believe we can spot brilliance easily, that it announces itself with confidence, with fluency, with the right accent or posture or pedigree. But talent doesn't follow a single script. Sometimes it arrives softly. Sometimes it sits in the middle row. Sometimes it's still learning how and whether it's safe to speak. When environments reward only the loudest voices, the most confident performers, the most recognizable patterns, they miss something essential. They miss depth. And when that happens, mockery becomes a defense. Because mockery is easier than uncertainty. It's easier to laugh than to admit you might be wrong. Easier to dismiss than to reconsider. Easier to believe that the system is fair than to question whether it might be incomplete. The narrator says it plainly. Mockery is often fear in disguise. Fear of losing authority. Fear of being challenged. Fear of discovering that what you thought was mastery might actually be habit. In the story, the professor didn't begin as a villain. He believed in standards, in discipline, in rigor. But belief becomes dangerous when it hardens into assumption, when it stops listening. The turning point wasn't the solution. It was the moment he paused. The moment authority checked itself instead of doubling down. That moment matters because it's rare. In many rooms, silence follows not because truth has been found, but because power has decided the conversation is over. How many ideas in there? How many solutions never surface because the person holding them learned long ago that it's safer to stay quiet? How many innovations are delayed, not by lack of intelligence, but by lack of invitation? These questions don't apply only to classrooms. They echo in offices, in courtrooms, in boardrooms, in meetings where some voices are heard automatically, while others must earn the right to speak again and again. The story reminds us that fairness isn't just about giving everyone the same test. It's about making sure the test itself isn't built on unexamined assumptions. Because when assumptions go unchallenged, they don't just limit individuals. They limit truth. The student in that room didn't seek to embarrass anyone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand recognition. He simply worked patiently, carefully, until the work spoke for him. And when it did, it forced everyone else to listen. That's the lesson. Not that genius always wins. Not that authority is always wrong. But that progress depends on humility, on the willingness to ask, what might I be missing? Because the most dangerous sentence in any room isn't, I don't know. It's, I already know who belongs. And the most powerful moments, the ones that change everything, often begin not with noise, but with a quiet hand raised, and the courage to let it finish its thought. The classroom is empty now. Rows of chairs sit neatly beneath fluorescent lights that hum softly, as if the room itself hasn't realized the moment has passed. The whiteboard at the front has been wiped clean almost. A faint shadow remains. A ghost of symbols where the equation once lived, smudges where the eraser passed too quickly. A thin haze that only appears when you look closely, when you know what was there before. The board looks ordinary again. That's what makes it unsettling. Because just hours earlier, this space held certainty, confidence, a clear line between who was believed and who was not. Now it holds questions. The narrator's voice returns, slower than before, calmer, no urgency left to prove anything. The professor thought he was testing intelligence. He was really testing himself. The truth is, no one enters a room expecting to fail that test. Authority rarely wakes up planning to be unfair. Bias doesn't usually announce itself with cruelty. It arrives dressed as routine, as expertise, as habit reinforced by years of being right, or at least not being challenged. In that classroom, the professor believed he was measuring readiness, measuring rigor, measuring who could survive the pressure of high expectations. But what he was really measuring was familiarity, who looked like success, who sounded like preparation, who felt safe to call on. And without realizing it, he built a test that rewarded comfort more than curiosity. The equation was never just math. It was a mirror. A mirror held up to a system that quietly decides whose ideas are worth time and whose are worth silence. A system that confuses confidence with competence and volume with value. The student didn't shatter that system with force. He didn't challenge it loudly, didn't argue his place, didn't demand recognition. He simply stayed long enough for the truth to become unavoidable. That's why the moment lingered. Not because someone was humiliated, but because something honest finally surfaced. As the chairs remain empty, it's easy to imagine how many times rooms like this have reset without noticing what they missed. How many boards have been erased before the right question was allowed to finish forming. How many raised hands were ignored, not out of malice, but out of assumption. We like to believe merit always rises. But merit needs oxygen. It needs space. It needs patience. It needs someone willing to pause long enough to listen. Without that, brilliance can spend a lifetime sitting quietly in the middle row taking notes, doing the work, waiting for a moment that never comes. The narrator speaks again, softer still. Silence isn't always emptiness. Sometimes it's uninvited brilliance. Think about the rooms you move through, the meetings, the classrooms, the conversations where decisions are made. Who speaks first? Who gets interrupted? Who gets the benefit of doubt and who has to earn it repeatedly? And how many voices have you learned to overlook, simply because they don't sound like the ones you're used to hearing? The professor learned something that day, but not because he lost authority. He learned because he used it differently. He paused. He checked. He allowed the possibility that the test itself might be flawed. That moment didn't erase his expertise. It refined it. And that's the difference between power that protects itself and power that grows. The board remains faintly marked. Soon, even that will fade. The room will host another class, another lecture, another assumption, waiting quietly to be challenged. The narrator lets the silence stretch before the final words, not as an accusation, as an invitation. How many brilliant minds are dismissed before they're ever allowed to speak? The question hangs there unanswered, waiting, just like the ones who raise their hands and hope someone is finally ready to listen.